Imagine a world where cats were not curled up beside humans, not quietly walking through homes, not watching from windows or rooftops, but instead moving silently through wild landscapes, hunting alone, living entirely on instinct, completely independent from human life. And now imagine that not once but twice in history, these same creatures crossed the boundary between wild and human civilization, forming a relationship so subtle, so unusual, that even today scientists are still uncovering how it truly happened. Because unlike dogs, which were actively trained and shaped by humans, cats followed a very different path, one where they were never fully controlled, never completely changed, but instead chose in their own quiet way to live alongside us. The story begins thousands of years ago, not in cities or homes, but in the early agricultural societies of the Near East, around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, when humans first began to settle, grow crops, and store grain, creating something that had never existed before on a large scale. A stable food supply that attracted not only people, but also pests, particularly rodents, which quickly became a serious problem for these early communities. And it was in this environment, where food was stored and protected, that wildcats first began to appear, drawn not to humans directly, but to the opportunity created by human activity. These early cats, likely belonging to the species Felis libica, the African wildcat, were not domesticated in the way we might imagine. They were not captured, trained, or bred intentionally, but instead approached human settlements on their own, hunting the rodents that lived near stored grain, and in doing so they provided a benefit to humans without needing to be controlled, creating a quiet, mutual relationship where both sides gained something without direct interaction. And this is what makes the domestication of cats so unique, because it was not forced, but allowed, not directed, but observed. Over time, this relationship deepened, not through commands or training, but through tolerance, where humans allowed these cats to remain because they were useful, and the cats stayed because the environment was rich with food. And slowly, across generations, certain cats became less fearful, more comfortable around human presence. Not because they were changed dramatically, but because those that could tolerate humans had a better chance of surviving and reproducing in this new environment. And through this natural process, a subtle form of domestication began to take place, one that was driven more by behavior than by human intention. Archaeological evidence supports this quiet transformation, particularly the discovery of a burial site in Cyprus, dating back around 9,500 years, where a human was found buried alongside a cat, suggesting that by this time, the relationship had already moved beyond simple coexistence into something more meaningful, something that included connection, perhaps even companionship. And this moment represents one of the earliest signs that cats were becoming part of human life in a deeper way. As human societies expanded, so did the presence of these early domesticated cats, spreading across regions as people moved, traded, and built new settlements, carrying with them not only crops and tools, but also the animals that had become part of their environment. And in this way, cats gradually spread throughout the ancient world, adapting to different climates, different cultures, and different ways of life, while still maintaining much of their original independence. But what makes this story even more fascinating is that this was not the only time cats became connected to humans, because thousands of years later, a second wave of domestication began, one that followed a similar pattern but in a different context, showing that this relationship was not a single event, but something that could happen again under the right conditions. And this second chapter would take place in a civilization where cats would become not just useful, but deeply symbolic, deeply valued, and almost sacred. And as we move slowly into this next part of the story, the quiet presence of those early wildcats begins to shift into something more visible, more defined, and more closely tied to human culture, revealing how a relationship that began in silence would eventually become one of the most recognizable connections between humans and animals in history. As we continue forward, the quiet relationship that first began in early farming villages now moves into one of the most fascinating phases in human history, where cats were no longer just tolerated hunters living on the edges of settlements, but became deeply woven into the identity, belief system, and daily life of an entire civilization. And this shift did not happen suddenly, but slowly, as cats followed humans into new regions, carried along trade routes, ships, and expanding communities, until they reached a place where their role would transform completely. And that place was ancient Egypt, where the second major phase of cat domestication took shape in a way that was far more visible, far more intentional, and far more culturally significant than the first. In Egypt, the environment created a perfect continuation of what had already begun thousands of years earlier. Because, like the early farmers of the Near East, Egyptian society relied heavily on agriculture, particularly along the Nile River, where grain was stored in large quantities, and once again, rodents became a serious threat, attracting wildcats that found these human settlements to be ideal hunting grounds. And just as before, humans benefited from their presence, allowing the relationship to continue. But in Egypt, something different began to happen, something deeper, something that moved beyond simple usefulness into something almost symbolic. Over time, cats in Egypt became more than just pest controllers. They became associated with protection, balance, and even divine presence. And this transformation can be seen in the way Egyptians began to represent cats in their art, their carvings, and their religious beliefs, most notably through the goddess Bastet, who was often depicted with the head of a cat, representing home, fertility, and protection. And this connection between cats and divinity elevated their status in a way that had never happened before, turning them into animals that were not only respected, but revered. This shift had real-world consequences because in ancient Egypt, harming a cat was considered a serious offense, and historical accounts suggest that even accidental harm could lead to severe punishment, showing just how important these animals had become within society. And beyond this, cats were often kept within homes, not only for practical reasons, but as part of family life, indicating that the relationship had now fully moved into the realm of companionship, something that had only begun to appear in the earlier stages of domestication. Archaeological discoveries further support this transformation, with evidence of cat burials, mummified cats, and even entire cemeteries dedicated to them, showing that cats were not only valued in life, but honored in death. And this level of care and attention suggests a relationship that had become deeply emotional as well as practical, marking a clear difference from the earlier phase of domestication, where the connection was based primarily on mutual benefit. At the same time, cats continued to spread beyond Egypt, carried along trade networks, particularly through maritime routes, where ships traveling across the Mediterranean often carried cats to control rodents on board. And through this movement, cats reached new regions such as Greece, Rome, and beyond. gradually becoming part of different cultures, each adapting the presence of cats in its own way, sometimes valuing them highly, sometimes seeing them simply as useful animals, but always maintaining that unique balance between independence and coexistence. What makes this second phase of domestication so important is that it did not replace the first but built upon it, reinforcing the traits that had already begun to develop, such as tolerance toward humans, adaptability to human environments, and the ability to live alongside people without losing their natural instincts. And this combination is what allowed cats to become one of the most widespread and recognizable domesticated animals in the world, while still retaining much of their wild nature. And as we continue to move deeper into this story, it becomes clear that the domestication of cats was never a single event, but a repeating pattern, one that emerged under similar conditions in different times and places, showing that this relationship was not forced, but naturally formed, shaped by opportunity, environment, and the quiet interaction between two very different species learning to exist together. As we continue deeper into this story, the connection between humans and cats now begins to feel more complete, not because it has reached an endpoint, but because we can now see both phases of domestication clearly, the first beginning quietly in early farming societies and the second becoming more visible and culturally powerful in ancient Egypt. And when we place these two together, a much clearer picture emerges, one that challenges the common idea of domestication itself. Because in the case of cats, what we are really seeing is not a single controlled process, but a repeated pattern where the same relationship formed more than once under similar conditions, driven not by human dominance, but by opportunity and adaptation. Unlike animals such as dogs, cattle, or horses, which were actively bred and shaped by humans for specific purposes, cats followed a different path entirely, one where their natural behavior already fit perfectly into human environments, meaning they did not need to be heavily altered to become useful. And this is one of the most important reasons why cats appear to have been domesticated twice, because the same situation, stored food attracting rodents and rodents attracting wildcats, could happen again and again wherever humans created stable settlements, allowing the relationship to form independently in multiple places. Genetic studies support this idea, showing that modern domestic cats share strong similarities with the African wildcat, but also reveal patterns of spread that match both the early Near Eastern domestication and the later Egyptian expansion, suggesting that while the original domestication began in one region, it was reinforced and expanded through later interactions, especially as cats were carried along trade routes, ships, and migrating populations, blending different groups together and strengthening the traits that allowed them to live alongside humans. What is especially fascinating is how little cats have changed compared to other domesticated animals, because even today, a domestic cat retains most of the physical and behavioral characteristics of its wild ancestors, including its hunting instincts, its independence, and its ability to survive without human support if necessary. And this tells us something very important about their domestication, that it was never about complete transformation, but about compatibility, about finding a balance where both species could benefit without needing to fully change. As cats spread further into Europe, Asia, and eventually other parts of the world, their role continued to evolve, sometimes valued, sometimes misunderstood, but always present. And in medieval Europe, for example, cats were sometimes associated with superstition, particularly during periods where fear and uncertainty influenced how animals were perceived. And this shift in perception shows that the relationship between humans and cats was not always stable, but changed depending on cultural context, even though the practical benefits of having cats around remained the same. At the same time, cats continued to travel with humans, especially on ships, where their role as hunters of rodents made them essential for protecting food supplies during long journeys. And through this movement, they reached distant regions, gradually becoming one of the most widespread animals in human history, not through organized breeding programs, but through simple coexistence, moving wherever humans moved, adapting quietly to new environments. What becomes increasingly clear as we reflect on all of this is that the domestication of cats was not an event with a clear beginning and end, but an ongoing process that could happen repeatedly wherever the right conditions existed. And this is what makes their story so unique, because it shows that domestication does not always require control, planning, or direct intervention, but can emerge naturally from shared environments and mutual benefit. And as we continue to move forward, the image of the wildcat slowly transforms into something familiar, not because it has lost its nature, but because it has found a place within human life without fully giving up what it once was, creating a relationship that feels both ancient and modern at the same time, one that continues quietly even today, wherever cats and humans share the same space. As we continue moving forward in this calm and uninterrupted flow, the story now begins to deepen beyond history alone and into understanding, where the domestication of cats no longer feels like something that simply happened in the past, but something that is still quietly visible in the present, because unlike many other domesticated animals, cats never fully crossed the line from wild to controlled. And this is what makes their story so different, so unusual, and so fascinating, because even after thousands of years of living alongside humans, a cat still behaves in ways that remind us of its origins, moving independently, choosing when to interact, and maintaining a level of self-reliance that is rarely seen in other domesticated species. If we look closely at modern cats, we can still see the same traits that allowed their ancestors to survive in the wild. Their hunting instincts remain sharp, their movements precise, their awareness constantly active. And even in a home environment, these behaviors continue to appear, not as something learned recently, but as something deeply embedded in their nature. And this continuity tells us that domestication, in the case of cats, was never about removing their wild side, but about allowing it to exist within a human environment without conflict. This is where the idea of domesticated twice becomes even more meaningful, because it shows that cats did not need to be forced into this role, but instead entered it naturally more than once, under similar conditions, where human settlements created opportunities and cats adapted to those opportunities in a way that benefited both sides. And this pattern is not something that belongs only to the distant past, but something that can still be observed in certain parts of the world today, where wild or semi-wild cats live near human communities, forming the same kind of quiet relationship that existed thousands of years ago. There is also something important in how humans responded to cats over time, because while cats adapted to human environments, humans also adapted to cats, learning to accept their independence, their unpredictable behavior, and their need for space. And this mutual adjustment is what allowed the relationship to continue. Because unlike other animals that were shaped to fit human needs, cats remained largely unchanged, and humans adjusted their expectations instead, creating a unique balance that has lasted across centuries. As we continue to reflect, the story begins to feel less like a process of domestication and more like a partnership, one where neither side fully dominates the other, but instead, both exist together in a shared space, each maintaining its own nature while still benefiting from the relationship. And this idea challenges the traditional understanding of domestication, showing that it does not always require control or transformation, but can also emerge through coexistence and mutual advantage. There is also a quiet sense of repetition in this story, where the same pattern that occurred in the Near East and later in Egypt could, in theory, happen again under similar conditions, where humans create environments that attract prey, and cats follow, forming the same connection once more. And this possibility is what makes the domestication of cats feel less like a fixed moment in history and more like a natural process that can occur whenever the right balance exists. As we remain within this long and steady reflection, everything begins to feel connected, where the past and present are not separate, but part of the same continuous story, where the behavior of modern cats still carries the imprint of their ancient ancestors, and where the relationship between humans and cats continues to exist in much the same way it always has. Quiet, subtle, and based on mutual benefit rather than control. And as the world settles into this calm understanding, the image of the wild cat and the domestic cat no longer feels like two different things, but 2 points along the same path, connected by time, by environment, and by a relationship that formed not once, but more than once in a way that still continues today, quietly unfolding wherever humans and cats share the same space. As we continue moving deeper into this calm and uninterrupted journey, the story now begins to settle into its most complete and revealing form, where everything we have explored, early farming societies, ancient Egypt, natural adaptation, and repeated domestication, comes together into a single connected understanding, showing us that the relationship between humans and cats was never built on control, but on a quiet alignment of needs, where both species found something valuable in the presence of the other. And this alignment is what allowed the process to happen not just once, but more than once, across different times and places, without needing to be forced or directed. If we look at the full picture now, it becomes clear that the domestication of cats is one of the rare examples in history where humans did not actively shape an animal to fit their world, but instead created a world that the animal chose to enter. And this distinction is important because it explains why cats still behave differently from most domesticated animals, why they retain their independence, why they do not rely completely on humans, and why even today, they seem to exist on the edge between wild and domestic, never fully belonging to one side or the other. There is also something deeply consistent in how this relationship formed both times, because in both the Near East and Egypt, the same pattern appears. Humans created stable food supplies, rodents were attracted, cats followed. And over time, tolerance turned into coexistence, and coexistence slowly became something closer to companionship. And this repeated pattern is what gives strength to the idea that cats were domesticated twice, not as two completely separate events, but as two phases of the same natural process, unfolding under similar conditions in different moments of history. At the same time, this story helps us understand why cats were able to spread so successfully across the world. because they did not require strict control or specialized care. They adapted easily, they survived in a wide range of environments, and they could live both independently and alongside humans, allowing them to travel with people, settle in new regions, and become part of different cultures without losing their essential nature. And this adaptability is one of the key reasons why cats are now found almost everywhere humans live. As we remain within this long and steady reflection, another important realization begins to emerge, one that shifts our understanding of domestication itself, because the story of cats shows that domestication does not always mean complete dependence or transformation, but can also mean a balanced relationship, where both sides maintain their identity while still benefiting from each other. And this idea challenges the traditional definition, opening the possibility that domestication can take multiple forms, not all of which involve control or dominance. There is also a quiet sense of continuity that connects the ancient world to the present, because when we see a modern cat moving through a home, watching silently, or hunting even when it does not need to, we are seeing behaviors that are thousands of years old, carried forward through generations without being erased. And this continuity reminds us that the past is not gone, but still present in subtle ways, existing within the behavior and nature of the animals that share our world. And as we continue to move forward without breaking this flow, the story of how we domesticated cats twice now feels complete in its depth, not as a simple historical fact, but as a layered process that reveals something fundamental about both humans and animals, about how relationships can form naturally, how they can repeat under the right conditions, and how they can endure across time without losing their original nature, creating a connection that feels as ancient as it is familiar. As we continue moving forward in this same calm and uninterrupted flow, allowing the narrative to deepen without breaking into smaller or weaker segments, the story now reaches a point where everything begins to feel not only understood but quietly alive. Because what we have been following is not just a historical process that ended thousands of years ago, but something that still exists around us. Something that can be observed even today in the way cats behave, in the way they interact with humans, and in the way they maintain a balance between independence and coexistence that has remained almost unchanged across time. And this continuity is what makes their domestication so unique, because it never fully separated them from their origins. If we look carefully at the environments where cats live today, whether in homes, cities, farms, or even on the edges of human settlements, we begin to see the same patterns repeating that first brought them close to humans in the ancient world, where food sources attract smaller animals and cats follow, creating a natural cycle that does not require planning or control. And this repetition is not accidental, but part of a deeper ecological balance, where cats continue to occupy the same role they always have, even as the world around them has changed dramatically. There is also something important in how cats move between worlds, where they can exist comfortably within a human home, relying on people for food and shelter, and yet still retain the ability to survive independently if necessary. A trait that is rare among domesticated animals, and this ability reflects the way their domestication developed, not through complete dependence, but through adaptation, allowing them to exist in both environments without losing their essential nature. At the same time, the human perception of cats has continued to evolve, shifting across cultures and periods of history, wherein sometimes in places they have been admired and valued, and in others misunderstood or even feared. Yet despite these changing attitudes, the underlying relationship has remained stable, because the practical and natural connection between humans and cats continues to exist, regardless of how it is interpreted, showing that this relationship is not easily broken by cultural change alone. As we remain within this long and steady reflection, another layer becomes visible, one that shows how the domestication of cats is not only a story about animals, but also a story about human environments, because it reveals how the way we live, the way we build, and the way we store food can shape the behavior of other species, creating opportunities for relationships that might not have existed otherwise. And this understanding gives us a broader view of domestication, showing that it is not always about controlling animals, but sometimes about creating conditions where animals choose to adapt. There is also a quiet sense of repetition that continues to echo through this story, where the same process that happened thousands of years ago could still happen again, where wildcats or similar species could begin to live alongside humans under the right conditions, forming the same kind of relationship once more. And this possibility reinforces the idea that the domestication of cats was not a one-time event, but a natural process that can emerge whenever the environment allows it. And as we continue to remain within this calm and continuous flow, without forcing a sudden ending, the story now feels fully expanded, where the past and present are connected, where the behavior of modern cats reflects their ancient origins, and where the relationship between humans and cats continues quietly, shaped by the same balance that first brought them together, a balance of independence, adaptation, and coexistence that has endured across thousands of years without losing its original form. As we continue moving forward within this same deep and uninterrupted flow, allowing the narrative to remain strong, immersive, and free from short or broken lines, the story now reaches a point where everything begins to feel fully connected, where the idea of domestication itself starts to shift from something simple into something far more complex. Because what we have seen with cats is not a clear transformation from wild to tame, but a gradual blending of two worlds, where the boundaries never fully disappeared, and where even after thousands of years, the line between wild and domestic still exists, faint but visible, in the behavior, instincts, and independence of every cat that lives alongside humans today. If we pause within this understanding and look closely, it becomes clear that cats never truly gave up control of their lives in the way other domesticated animals did. Because while dogs, for example, were shaped to follow human commands, to depend on human guidance, and to exist within a structured relationship, cats remained self-directed, making their own decisions, choosing when to interact, and maintaining a level of autonomy that reflects their wild ancestry. And this is not a failure of domestication, but a different kind of success, one that shows that a relationship can exist without full control, without complete dependence, and still remain stable across time. There is also something deeply revealing in how humans adapted to this, because instead of forcing cats to change completely, humans adjusted their expectations, accepting their independence, allowing them space, and building a relationship that worked with their nature rather than against it. And this mutual adjustment is one of the key reasons why the domestication of cats was able to happen more than once, because it did not rely on strict methods or controlled breeding alone, but on a flexible system where both sides could adapt to each other. As we continue to reflect, the idea of twice domesticated begins to feel less like two separate events and more like a repeating pattern, where the same conditions led to the same outcome. not because it was planned, but because it was natural. And this repetition tells us something important about how certain relationships form in history, where similar environments can produce similar results, even across different times and places, showing that some processes are not unique events but patterns that can appear again whenever the conditions are right. At the same time, this story also highlights the importance of environment in shaping behavior, because it was not human intention alone that brought cats into this relationship, but the environments humans created, the storage of food, the presence of pests, the stability of settlements. All of these factors combined to create an opportunity that cats responded to. And this shows that domestication can begin not with direct action, but with indirect influence, where the choices humans make about how they live can shape the behavior of other species in ways that are subtle but lasting. There is also a quiet sense of continuity that runs through everything we have explored, where the ancient past does not feel separate from the present, but connected to it, where the cats that once moved through early farming villages and ancient Egyptian homes are not so different from the ones we see today. And this continuity gives the story a kind of calm stability, where even though thousands of years have passed, the core of the relationship remains unchanged. And as we continue to remain within this long and steady flow, without rushing toward a final conclusion just yet, the story of how we domesticated cats twice now feels complete in its depth and meaning, revealing not only how it happened but why it happened, and what it tells us about the nature of relationships between humans and animals, showing us that sometimes the most lasting connections are not built through control, but through balance, adaptation, and the quiet decision to exist together. As we continue moving forward in this same deep, steady, and uninterrupted flow, allowing the narrative to fully expand without breaking its immersion, the story now reaches a point where everything we have explored begins to settle into a final understanding that feels complete, not because it ends suddenly, but because every layer has been revealed, connected, and allowed to exist within the same calm structure, showing us that the domestication of cats is not just a historical event, but a reflection of something much broader about how humans and animals interact over time, how relationships form naturally, and how those relationships can endure without losing their original balance. When we look back across the full journey, from the first wildcats approaching early farming settlements in the Near East, to the cultural transformation of cats in ancient Egypt, to their spread across continents and their continued presence in modern life, a clear pattern emerges, one that does not rely on force, control, or sudden change, but on gradual adaptation, where both humans and cats adjusted to each other in small ways over long periods of time, creating a relationship that feels stable, not because it was controlled, but because it was allowed to grow naturally. What makes this story truly unique is that it challenges one of the most common assumptions about domestication: the idea that humans must actively shape and control animals in order to bring them into their world. Because in the case of cats, the opposite is closer to the truth, where humans created conditions that attracted cats and cats chose to stay, forming a connection that was based on opportunity rather than obligation. And this difference is what allowed the process to happen more than once under similar conditions, without needing to be repeated through deliberate effort. There is also something quietly powerful in how little cats have changed throughout this entire process. Because even after thousands of years of living alongside humans, they still carry the same instincts, the same behaviors, and the same independence that defined their ancestors. And this continuity reminds us that domestication does not always mean transformation, but can also mean coexistence, where an animal can remain true to its nature while still becoming part of human life. As we remain within this calm and reflective understanding, the idea of twice domesticated now feels less like a surprising fact and more like a natural outcome of the conditions that existed, where the same environment led to the same relationship forming again, reinforcing what had already begun and allowing it to spread further, deeper, and more widely across the world, until it became one of the most familiar human-animal relationships that exists today. There is also a deeper lesson that emerges from all of this, one that feels simple but meaningful, that not all relationships need to be controlled in order to last, that balance can sometimes be more powerful than dominance, and that adaptation can create stability in ways that force cannot. And this lesson extends beyond the story of cats, offering a broader perspective on how connections form and endure over time. And as the world gently settles into stillness once more, the image of those early wildcats moving silently through ancient fields blends seamlessly with the image of modern cats resting in homes, creating a continuous line that stretches across thousands of years, showing us that this relationship has never truly ended. It has only evolved, quietly and naturally, into something that still exists today, unchanged at its core, and deeply connected to the same balance that first brought humans and cats together so long ago. If you enjoyed this calm, immersive, and deeply connected journey through history, then don't forget to like the video and subscribe, so more long and fascinating stories can continue to unfold in the same seamless and relaxing way. As we continue moving deeper into this story, without breaking the rhythm and without rushing toward an ending, the entire journey of cats and humans now begins to feel like something much bigger than just domestication, because what we are really looking at is a rare example of how two completely different species slowly learn to exist together, without one fully controlling the other. And this balance is what allowed the relationship to survive, to repeat, and to spread across the world in a way that almost no other animal has managed to achieve in the same form. The more we stay within this perspective, the clearer it becomes that cats were never fully domesticated in the traditional sense, but instead formed a partnership that remained flexible, adaptable, and capable of reappearing whenever the conditions were right. If we go back once more to those early settlements where humans first stored grain and unintentionally created environments filled with rodents, we begin to understand that the presence of cats was not planned, not designed, and not controlled, but simply a natural response to opportunity. And this is what makes the entire process so powerful, because it did not require knowledge, intention, or even awareness from humans at the beginning. It only required a change in environment. And once that environment existed, the rest followed almost automatically, showing that sometimes the most important historical processes are not driven by direct action, but by indirect consequences. This same idea continues into the second phase in Egypt, where what began as a practical relationship slowly transformed into something cultural and symbolic. Yet even there, the core of the relationship remained the same. Cats were still hunters, still independent, still self-directed, and even as they were admired, protected, and even worshipped, they were never fully controlled. And this consistency across both phases is what confirms that we are not looking at two completely different domestications, but two expressions of the same underlying pattern, one quiet, one visible, but both built on the same foundation. There is also something deeply important in how cats moved with humans across the world. Because unlike animals that required structured breeding or controlled transport, cats spread naturally, traveling on ships, moving through trade routes, settling wherever humans settled, and adapting quickly to new environments. And this ability to spread without strict control allowed them to become one of the most widespread animals in human history, not because they were forced into every region, but because they were able to survive and thrive wherever they arrived, maintaining that same balance between independence and coexistence. As we continue to reflect, the idea of twice domesticated begins to expand even further, because it suggests that this process is not limited to the past, that under the right conditions, the same relationship could continue to appear again and again wherever humans create stable environments that attract prey, and wherever cats are present to respond to those conditions, meaning that domestication, in this case, is not a fixed event, but a repeating possibility, something that belongs to a pattern rather than a single moment in history. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle in here, one that changes how we see cats entirely. Because instead of viewing them as animals that were shaped by humans, we begin to see them as animals that adapted to humans on their own terms, choosing when to approach, when to stay, and how to interact, creating a relationship that feels less like ownership and more like coexistence. And this perspective explains why, even today, cats often appear to live alongside humans rather than under them, maintaining their independence while still benefiting from the connection. At the same time, humans also changed in response to cats, learning to accept their behavior, to work with their nature rather than against it, and to build environments where both could exist comfortably. And this mutual adaptation is what made the relationship stable across thousands of years, because it did not rely on force or strict control, but on a balance that both sides could maintain without conflict. And as we remain within this long, continuous flow, allowing the story to stretch fully without cutting it short, everything now begins to feel complete in a deeper way, where the past and present connect seamlessly, where the wild cat and the domestic cat are no longer separate ideas, but part of the same ongoing story, and where the domestication of cats is understood not as a single event, but as a pattern that has already happened more than once, and could, in theory, continue to happen again, quietly, naturally, and without needing to be forced. As we continue forward without closing the story, keeping the flow deep, continuous, and fully immersive, the relationship between humans and cats now begins to reveal its most subtle and powerful layer, something that goes beyond history, beyond domestication, and into the way this connection has quietly shaped both species over time. Because when we look closely, we begin to see that this was never a one-sided process. It was not just cats adapting to humans, but humans also adjusting their environments, their expectations, and even their behavior to accommodate cats, creating a shared space where both could exist without conflict. And this balance is what allowed the relationship to remain stable across thousands of years without needing strict control or constant intervention. If we focus on how cats behave even today, it becomes clear that they still operate on the same principles that guided their ancestors. They observe before they act, they choose rather than follow, and they interact on their own terms. And yet, despite this independence, they continue to remain close to humans, which suggests that the relationship is not based on dependence, but on preference, where cats stay because the environment suits them, because the benefits are consistent, And because the balance works and this idea of choice is what makes their domestication fundamentally different from most other animals. At the same time, human environments have continued to evolve in ways that support this relationship, where cities, homes, farms, and even small settlements all create conditions that are familiar to cats. Places where food sources exist, where shelter is available, and where the presence of humans does not disrupt their natural behavior, but instead complements it. And this continuity of environment is what allows the relationship to persist, because even as the world changes, the basic conditions that first brought cats and humans together have not disappeared. There is also something important in how cats maintain their role within these environments, because even when they are fully cared for, fully fed, and fully integrated into human life, they still display hunting behavior, still respond to movement, still act on instinct. And this shows that domestication in their case did not replace their natural function, but allowed it to exist alongside a new context, creating a dual existence where they are both part of human life and still connected to their wild origins. As we remain within this long and steady reflection, another layer becomes visible, one that shows how this relationship has been sustained not through strict systems, but through flexibility, where both humans and cats adapt continuously to each other, adjusting behavior, space, and interaction in ways that maintain balance without requiring force. And this flexibility is what allows the relationship to survive across different cultures, different environments, and different time periods without breaking. There is also a quiet realization that the domestication of cats is not something that ended in the past, but something that continues in small ways even now. Wherever new environments are created, wherever new spaces form where cats can exist alongside humans, the same pattern can reappear, reinforcing the idea that this is not a closed chapter in history, but an ongoing process that still unfolds wherever the conditions allow. And as we continue to move forward without ending the story, allowing it to remain open and expanding, the connection between humans and cats now feels fully alive, not as something that belongs only to ancient times, but as something that exists in the present, shaped by the same balance, the same independence, and the same quiet coexistence that first brought them together, continuing steadily, without needing to change its fundamental nature. As we continue moving forward without breaking this deep and steady flow, allowing the narrative to remain strong, immersive, and fully connected, the story now reaches a point where everything we have explored begins to settle into its most refined understanding, where the idea of domestication itself feels different, no longer something simple or one-directional, but something layered, flexible, and shaped by both environment and behavior over long periods of time. And as we remain within this calm reflection, it becomes clear that cats represent one of the most unique examples of how a relationship between humans and animals can form, evolve, and repeat, without ever becoming fully controlled or fully dependent. If we take a moment to observe how cats exist in different parts of the world today, from fully domestic indoor cats to street cats, farm cats, and even semi-wild populations living on the edges of cities, we begin to see that all of these variations are part of the same continuum, not separate categories but different expressions of the same relationship, where some cats live very closely with humans while others remain more independent, and yet all of them are connected through the same history, the same origins, and the same ability to adapt to human environments without losing their natural instincts. This range of existence is something that rarely appears in other domesticated animals, because most have been shaped into specific roles or conditions, but cats remain flexible, able to move between different levels of dependence and independence depending on their environment. And this flexibility is one of the key reasons why their domestication could happen more than once, because it did not require a fixed system, but could emerge naturally under different conditions, producing similar results each time. There is also something deeply revealing in how this relationship has remained stable, despite changes in human society, because over thousands of years, humans have moved from small agricultural villages to large cities, from simple storage systems to complex infrastructure. And yet cats have continued to fit into these environments with very little change, adapting quietly, adjusting their behavior where necessary, but always maintaining that same core identity that connects them back to their wild ancestors. As we continue to reflect, the idea of twice domesticated begins to feel less like a rare or unusual event and more like a natural outcome of a species that is perfectly suited to human environments, where the same conditions can produce the same relationship again and again, reinforcing what already exists and allowing it to spread further over time. And this perspective shifts the focus away from the idea of domestication as a single historical moment, and toward the idea of domestication as a repeating pattern shaped by environment and opportunity. At the same time, there is a quiet awareness that this relationship has influenced not only how cats live, but also how humans perceive and interact with animals more broadly, because it shows that not all connections need to be based on control or dominance, that coexistence can be just as effective, and that allowing a species to retain its natural behavior can still result in a stable and lasting relationship. And this idea has subtle implications for how we understand other forms of domestication and interaction with the natural world. And as we remain within this long, continuous flow, without closing the narrative yet, everything now feels fully connected and complete in its depth, where the past and present exist together, where the story of early wild cats blends seamlessly with the behavior of modern cats, and where the domestication of cats is understood not as something that happened once and ended, but as something that has happened more than once and continues quietly, shaped by the same balance, the same environment, and the same unique connection between two very different species. As we continue forward in this same deep and uninterrupted flow, allowing the narrative to expand fully without breaking its immersion, the story now reaches a level where everything begins to feel not only connected, but almost inevitable, as if the relationship between humans and cats was always going to form under the right conditions, not because it was planned, not because it was forced, but because the nature of both species allowed it to happen in a way that required very little direct intervention. And as we remain within this calm and steady understanding, it becomes clear that what we have been following is not just a historical event, but a natural pattern that reveals how certain connections emerge when environment, behavior, and opportunity align in just the right way. If we step back and look at the full timeline once more, from the earliest agricultural settlements in the Near East to the cultural expansion in ancient Egypt and beyond, we begin to see that this relationship did not move in a straight line, but in overlapping phases, where one period influenced the next, where the early domestication created a foundation that was later strengthened and expanded, and where the spread of cats across regions allowed these traits to become more stable and more widespread over time, creating a network of populations that were connected not by a single origin alone, but by repeated interaction with human environments. There is also something deeply important in how this process remained largely invisible while it was happening. Because unlike other domesticated animals that were bred, trained, and controlled in obvious ways, the domestication of cats happened quietly, without clear records, without structured programs, and without a defined moment where humans could say that the process had begun or ended. And this lack of visibility is what makes the story more complex, because it forces us to rely on archaeology, genetics, and careful observation to reconstruct what happened, piecing together clues that were never meant to be recorded in the first place. As we continue to reflect, the idea of cats being domesticated twice now feels fully grounded, not as a simple repetition, but as a reinforcement of the same relationship under different conditions, where the first phase introduced the connection, and the second phase expanded and strengthened it, embedding it more deeply into human culture and allowing it to spread more widely. And this layered process is what gives the story its depth, showing that domestication can happen in stages, not all at once, but gradually, building over time. At the same time, there is a quiet realization that this relationship has remained remarkably stable despite the passage of thousands of years. Because even as human societies have changed dramatically, the core interaction between humans and cats has remained almost the same, based on shared space, mutual benefit, and a balance of independence. And this stability suggests that the relationship reached a point where it no longer needed to evolve further in order to survive, because it was already perfectly suited to the conditions in which it existed. There is also something quietly fascinating in how this story continues to exist in everyday life, where the presence of cats in homes, streets, and communities reflects a connection that began long before recorded history, and yet still feels natural and familiar, as if it has always been part of the human experience. And this continuity gives the story a sense of timelessness, where the past does not feel distant, but present in subtle and constant ways. And as we remain within this calm, steady, and uninterrupted flow, without rushing toward a final conclusion, everything now feels fully expanded and deeply understood, where the domestication of cats is no longer just a fact or a theory, but a complete narrative that reveals how relationships can form naturally, repeat under the right conditions, and endure across time without losing their original balance, creating a connection that feels as quiet as it is lasting. As we continue forward in this same deep and uninterrupted flow, allowing the narrative to remain rich, immersive, and fully connected without breaking into short or weak segments, the story now reaches a point where everything begins to settle into its most complete and thoughtful understanding, where the idea of cats being domesticated twice is no longer just a historical explanation, but a window into how relationships between species can form naturally, repeat over time, and remain stable without ever becoming fully controlled or fully dependent. And as we stay within this calm reflection, it becomes clear that what makes this story truly unique is not just that it happened twice, but that it could happen at all in such a consistent and quiet way. If we carefully observe the full pattern one more time, we begin to see that each stage of this process followed the same underlying structure. Humans created environments where food was stored and protected. These environments attracted smaller animals, and those animals attracted cats. And from that point onward, everything unfolded gradually. Not through direct action, but through repeated interaction, where cats that could tolerate human presence thrived, and humans who recognized the benefit of cats allowed them to remain. creating a feedback loop that strengthened the relationship over time without requiring control or deliberate planning. There is also something deeply important in how this process depended on time, not in the sense of a few years or even a few generations, but across centuries, where small changes accumulated slowly, where behavior shifted gradually, and where the relationship deepened almost unnoticed. And this long time scale is what allowed the domestication of cats to feel so natural, because it did not happen quickly enough to be seen as a sudden change, but slowly enough to become part of the environment itself. As we remain within this steady reflection, another layer becomes visible, one that shows how this relationship has always existed on a balance between closeness and distance, where cats could live near humans without fully belonging to them, where they could benefit from human environments without losing their independence, and where this balance created a form of coexistence that is both stable and flexible, allowing the relationship to adapt to different conditions without breaking. At the same time, this story reveals something about humans as well, because it shows that not all successful relationships come from control or dominance, that sometimes allowing space, allowing independence, and allowing natural behavior can create a stronger and more lasting connection than trying to reshape something completely. And this idea gives the story a broader meaning, one that extends beyond animals and into how relationships in general can form and endure. There is also a quiet sense of repetition that continues to echo through everything we have explored, where the same conditions can lead to the same outcomes again and again, suggesting that this process is not unique to a specific moment in history, but part of a larger pattern that can emerge whenever the right balance exists, reinforcing the idea that the domestication of cats is not a closed chapter, but an ongoing possibility. And as we continue to remain within this long, calm, and uninterrupted flow, without rushing toward the final conclusion just yet, everything now feels fully connected and deeply understood, where the story of cats moving from wild landscapes into human environments, not once but more than once, becomes a reflection of how nature and human activity can align in ways that create lasting relationships, relationships that continue quietly across time, shaped by the same balance that first brought them together. As we continue moving forward in this same deep, uninterrupted, and immersive flow, allowing the narrative to stretch fully without breaking into smaller fragments, the story now reaches a point where everything begins to feel settled, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of full understanding, where each layer we have explored, environment, behavior, repetition, adaptation, and coexistence, comes together into a single, continuous pattern that explains not only how cats were domesticated twice, but why this process was even possible in the first place. And as we remain within this calm and steady reflection, it becomes clear that what we are looking at is not just a historical curiosity, but a rare example of balance between two species that managed to sustain itself across thousands of years without losing its original structure. If we take a wider view now, stepping slightly back while still remaining inside this flow, we begin to see that the domestication of cats reflects a deeper interaction between humans and the natural world, where human activity creates changes in the environment, and those changes influence the behavior of other species, leading to new relationships that were not directly planned but emerge naturally over time. And this interaction is something that continues even today, where the way humans build, live, and organize space still shapes the presence and behavior of animals around them, including cats, which continue to respond to these environments in ways that are consistent with their ancient origins. There is also something quietly remarkable in how stable this relationship has remained. Because while many aspects of human life have changed dramatically over the past thousands of years, from small settlements to large cities, from simple agriculture to complex systems, the basic connection between humans and cats has remained almost unchanged, still based on shared space, mutual benefit, and a balance of independence. And this stability suggests that the relationship reached a form that did not require further transformation, because it was already well suited to survive across different conditions. At the same time, we begin to understand that the idea of cats being domesticated twice is not just about two separate points in time, but about a process that reinforced itself, where the early domestication created a foundation and the later expansion strengthened and spread it, ensuring that the traits which allowed cats to live alongside humans became more common and more stable. And this layered process is what allowed cats to become so widespread without losing their essential nature. As we continue to reflect within this long and uninterrupted narrative, another layer becomes visible, one that shows how the success of this relationship depended not on control, but on compatibility, where cats did not need to be changed drastically, because they were already suited to the environments humans created. And this compatibility is what made the relationship sustainable, because it did not require constant effort to maintain, but could continue naturally, as long as the basic conditions remained in place. There is also a quiet sense of continuity that runs through everything we have explored, where the past does not feel separate from the present, but directly connected to it, where the behavior of modern cats reflects patterns that began thousands of years ago, and where the environments humans live in today still support the same relationship that first formed in ancient times, creating a sense that this story is not something distant, but something ongoing. And as we remain within this calm, steady, and fully expanded flow, without moving toward a sudden ending, the story now feels complete in its depth and clarity, where the domestication of cats is understood not as a simple event, but as a repeating pattern shaped by environment, behavior, and time. A pattern that has already occurred more than once and continues quietly wherever humans and cats share the same space. As we now move into the final stretch of this long and uninterrupted journey, allowing the story to close gently rather than abruptly, everything we have explored begins to come together into a complete and steady understanding, where the domestication of cats no longer feels like a simple historical event, but a continuous process shaped by time, environment, and behavior. A process that did not rely on force or control, but on balance, adaptation, and the quiet alignment of needs between two very different species. And as we remain within this calm reflection, it becomes clear that what makes this story so unique is not just that it happened twice, but that it could happen at all in such a natural and consistent way. When we look back across the full journey, from the early agricultural settlements of the Near East where wildcats first approached human environments, to the cultural transformation in ancient Egypt, where cats became deeply valued and symbolically important, and then to their spread across the world through trade, travel, and migration, we begin to see that this was never a single moment of domestication, but a layered process that unfolded over thousands of years, where each phase built upon the previous one, strengthening the relationship and allowing it to expand without losing its original nature. There is also something deeply important in how little cats themselves have changed throughout this entire process, because even now, After thousands of years of living alongside humans, they still carry the same instincts, the same behaviors, and the same independence that defined their wild ancestors. And this continuity is what confirms that their domestication was never about transformation in the traditional sense, but about coexistence, about finding a way to share space without removing what made them who they are. At the same time, humans also adapted, learning to live with an animal that does not fully submit, that does not follow commands in the same way as other domesticated species, and that maintains its own sense of control. And this adjustment is what allowed the relationship to remain stable. Because instead of forcing change, humans allowed space, accepted independence, and built an environment where both could exist comfortably. As we reflect on the idea of cats being domesticated twice, it now feels less like a surprising anomaly and more like a natural outcome of the conditions that existed, where the same environmental patterns produce the same relationship more than once, reinforcing the idea that domestication in this case is not a single event tied to a specific time, but a repeating possibility that can emerge whenever the balance between humans and the natural world allows it. There is also a quiet understanding that settles in here, one that feels simple yet meaningful, that not all relationships need to be controlled in order to last, that sometimes the most stable connections are the ones that allow for independence, that respect natural behavior, and that grow gradually over time rather than being forced into place. And this idea gives the story a depth that extends beyond history, offering a way to understand how balance and adaptation can create something lasting. And as this journey gently comes to its close without breaking the calm and steady rhythm that has carried it from beginning to end, the image of the wild cat and the domestic cat now feels unified, not as two separate identities, but as part of the same continuous story, one that has unfolded more than once, one that still continues today, and one that reflects a unique and lasting connection between humans and animals, shaped not by control, but by coexistence, and carried forward quietly across time. If you enjoyed this long, immersive, and deeply connected journey through history, then don't forget to like the video and subscribe, so more calm and powerful stories can continue to unfold in the same seamless way.